Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. Later, I'll be joined by Dalia Gebrial. Coming up tonight, the government have announced a trial of fat loss injections to help people back into work. Keir Starmer may be about to apply national insurance employer contributions on pensions. It's not as boring as it sounds. And Russell Brand has got a new Grift. Yes, another one. Stay tuned for all of that. But first, the UK government may be about to see a major shift on illegal settlements in the West Bank. The UK government has announced sanctions against extremist settler groups in the West Bank. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, said this: "When I went to the West Bank earlier this year on one of my first trips as Foreign Secretary, I met with Palestinians whose communities have suffered horrific violence at the hands of Israeli settlers. The inaction of the Israeli government has allowed an environment of impunity to flourish where settler violence has been allowed to increase unchecked. Settlers have shockingly even targeted schools and families with young children. Today's measures will help bring accountability to those who have supported and perpetrated such heinous abuses of human rights. The Israeli government must crack down on settler violence and stop settler expansion on Palestinian land. As long as violent extremists remain unaccountable, the UK and the international community will continue to act." 3 settler outposts have been sanctioned for supporting and perpetrating, quote, heinous abuses of human rights against Palestinian communities in the occupied territory. They are Tirzah Valley Farm Outpost, Metarim Outpost, and Shuvi Eretz Outpost. 4 organizations have also been sanctioned today. They include a religious school called Od Yosef Chai Yeshiva, Israeli charity Torat Lashima, NGO Hashema Yosh, and a commercial construction company called Amana. October is a very dangerous time for Palestinians in the West Bank, as it is the beginning of the olive harvest, and there are traditionally increases in violence from illegal settlers. At least 747 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, and more than 6,200 have been wounded in the past 12 months. However, this announcement is not without precedent. The Conservative government under Rishi Sunak sanctioned a number of extremist Israeli groups and individuals for settler violence in the illegally occupied West Bank. Under David Cameron as Foreign Secretary, the Sunak government announced sanctions in February and May this year. And David Cameron revealed today that he even had been planning to impose sanctions on members of the Israeli cabinet.
I think there are perhaps other things we can do to put pressure on Netanyahu and say, look, of course we respect your right to self-defense, but we do want you to act within the law. And in fact, before I left office, I was working up sanctions on these 2 ministers, Minister Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who, when you look at what they say, they have said things like encouraging people to stop aid convoys getting into Gaza. They've encouraged extreme settlers in the West Bank with the appalling things they've been carrying out. And so actually saying to Netanyahu, yes, we support your right to self-defense. No, we're not going to end the sale of arms. But actually, when ministers in your government who are extremists and behave in this way, we're prepared to use our sanctions regime to say this simply isn't good enough and has to stop.
So why did those sanctions you were working up not happen?
I couldn't do them during the election period because I think it was too much of a political act, was the advice I received. But I'm a bit, I'm concerned that nothing's happened since. And as I say, I think the government's taken perhaps the wrong path. I wouldn't have done what they did on arms, but I would look again at this sanctions issue, because we've got to make sure the aid continues to get into Gaza. We've got to make sure that the settlers in illegal settlers in the West Bank don't behave in this way. But we've also got to maintain our support for Israel's right for self-defense. And that, enables us to have conversations with the Israelis, as I did, from a position of being a friend and a supporter and a believer in the right of Israel to defend itself, but at the same time have conversations, sometimes pretty tough conversations, as I did, for instance, over the treatment of detainees, which actually can produce some results. You should never overemphasize the extent to which you can change the approach of another country. But on the other hand, you should try and maximize your influence where you can.
Fascinating, isn't it? You don't overemphasize what you can achieve. I mean, apparently we can take on Russia, a nuclear armed state, its economy by purchasing parity, it's $5 trillion economy, not by nominal GDP, but by the measure that normally happens. We can defeat them, but we can't stop Israel doing certain things. Okay. Interesting there, though, however, is that what David Cameron claims he was planning to do is in excess of what David Lammy has done at the Foreign Office. To be clear, there have been sanctions on certain organizations in the West Bank, but not ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, which Cameron claims he was about to do. The implicit point there is that they weren't going to do it during an election because it probably would have had some kind of electoral cost for the Conservatives. Now, as it wages a war of aggression on two fronts, Israel has issued new evacuation orders for 20 villages in Lebanon. According to the UN, this means that 25% of the country, a whole quarter of its population, has been forced to evacuate. More than 1 million people have been displaced in Lebanon since Israel's invasion of the sovereign nation last month. Israel expanded the scope of its airstrikes yesterday by bombing a Christian-majority town in the north of the country. At least 22 people were killed and 8 injured, most of them women and children, according to the reports received by the UN's Human Rights Office. Airstrikes have previously focused on southern Lebanon, but yesterday's attack on the town of Aitu hit a house that had been rented by displaced families. Israel has a history of ordering evacuations and then turning the areas into kill zones, and that is what we can see happening in northern Gaza right now. At least 50 people have been killed across Gaza in the last 24 hours. 17 of them were in Gebrial refugee camp in the north of the Strip, which continues to be under siege from Israeli forces. Tens of thousands of Palestinians are trapped in northern Gaza without food or water, and no food has been allowed to enter the area since the 1st of October. An estimated 400,000 people are at risk of starvation. Amnesty International has released a statement today calling these evacuation orders Israel's euphemism for forced displacement and saying they must be rescinded. Amnesty's Middle East director said this: "The Israeli military has intensified its efforts to forcibly displace the entirety of the civilian population in the area north of Wadi Gaza to the south, starting with the North Gaza Governorate, forcing civilians to choose between starvation or displacement, while their homes and streets are relentlessly pounded by bombs and shells. The world must stop standing by while Israel uses siege, starvation, and atrocity crimes to forcibly displace and destroy civilians and civilian life. These orders must be rescinded, and there must be an immediate ceasefire by all parties to halt the avalanche of suffering that has been engulfing civilians in Gaza for over a year." I'm now joined by Dalia. Dalia, just to go back to that first story, are you surprised that Labour, and specifically David Lammy, have applied these sanctions to organisations in the West Bank?
Well, I mean, in a sense, no, because ultimately the Labour Party doesn't do anything, particularly when it comes to international policy, particularly when it comes to Israel. The Labour Party doesn't do anything unless it's gotten the political permission from the Conservative Party beforehand. And as you've mentioned, this kind of resonates a little bit with something that David Cameron had been working on, but actually doesn't even go as far as David Cameron went, in terms of trying to exceptionalize Israeli settler violence as something that is different and inherently worse than Israeli state violence. And the reason that this is being done, there's a political reason, and that reason is that ordinary people in Britain are disgusted and distressed and sickened, not only by what Israel is doing in Palestine and now in Lebanon, but by our government's ongoing support and active facilitation of that violence and genocide. And so in order to be seen to be responding to that disgust on the side of the British of people in Britain, in order to be seen to be doing something while doing nothing, which is pretty much the brand of Starmer's Labour, David Lammy is relying on this idea that everyday people might perceive this to be as, a real kind of sanction on, or be something that is being done about the kind of images that we are seeing. But it's entirely incoherent. First of all, you have, David Lammy talking about how shocking it is, or how exceptionally violent it is that these Israeli settlers are attacking women and children, are attacking schools, and are stopping aid from entering Gaza. the Israeli state has been doing the exact same thing on a much larger and deeper scale. So the idea that it's somehow exceptionally wrong when this group of people do it, but not when the entire entity that we are fueling with our militaristic political and financial support, that's somehow fine, is completely hypocritical. And also, it's incoherent because Israeli settler violence and Israeli state violence are deeply interconnected. The ability of Israeli settlers to violently seize Palestinian land is made possible because the Israeli state not only adopts a policy of inaction, as David Lammy called it, but actively facilitates it. We saw Ben Gvir last year handing out tens of thousands of assault rifles to settlers in the West Bank. That wasn't meant to be a conversation piece. It wasn't, a symbolic act. It was handing out weapons so that Israeli settlers could go ahead and commit these acts of violence that we're now seeing. When we see ministers again like Smotrich, who talk about the idea of a greater Israel, which would run from Jerusalem to Damascus in Syria. How do you think there is an expectation that will happen through settler violence? When settlers seize Palestinian land, it is the Israeli government that makes those settlements viable by building roads, providing infrastructure, electricity, and weaponry in order to maintain those settlements. So in what way can you, on the one hand, say that we are going to legitimize and validate and fuel both, with our money and our militaristic power and our political legitimization to fuel the Israeli state, and then somehow pick out this one strand of Israeli state activity and sanction that? It's basically the equivalent of like pouring kerosene on the region with one hand and handing out bottles of water with the other hand. This is nothing but a kind of performance politics that is David Lammy trying to respond to the clear grievance and rage and disgust that ordinary people in this country feel towards Britain's policy in Israel and towards Palestine, and basically trying to be seen to be doing something while doing nothing at all, and in fact continuing and creating this false division between Israeli settler violence and Israeli state violence is deeply obfuscating and is nothing but a continuation of the policy of enabling that this government that this government and the British government of the past, the Conservative government, that policy of enabling, which is the policy that unfortunately our government has had towards the Israeli genocide in Palestine.
That is such an astute point, Dalia, about trying to depict what's going on in the West Bank as exceptional. The whole thing is exceptional. Israel is exceptional in how it conducts wars abroad, how it kills diplomats or political figures overseas with extrajudicial killings, how it detains people. All of it is utterly, utterly exceptional. And this is not particularly distinct, like you say, from the way that the country conducts itself more broadly. I mean, this is really extraordinary. Gaza is only the Gaza Strip is 2% of the overall surface area of Israel, Gaza, the West Bank. And it's quite interesting. Why are so many Palestinians there? Why are there so many Palestinians concentrated in Gaza? It's because during what was ethnic cleansing, the Nakba, Egypt didn't open its border. That's why they're there. The whole thing's exceptional. The whole thing is built upon displacement, genocide, settler colonialism, as Dalia so adroitly put it. Let's talk about something slightly different. It's Israel's military capabilities, because Israel's air defenses are incredibly ropey right now. That's according to a report in the Financial Times. The country is facing a shortage of interceptor missiles for its Iron Dome defense system. And as a result, the US is providing an anti-missile battery to sit alongside Israel's existing air defenses. It's called THAAD. That stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. Back in April, Israel claimed that 99% of around 300 Iranian drones and missiles were intercepted. You might remember that was the first of 2 attacks by Iran against Israel. But when Iran fired over 180 ballistic missiles just over 2 weeks ago, which are qualitatively better weapons than you saw in April, at least 36 got through and hit, among other things, an Israeli airbase. One also exploded 700 meters from the Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. That's what the Israelis say. Who knows the precise details? What we know for sure is that at least several dozen projectiles got through. This is from that FT report, and I think it's a really key quote. Here it is. Israel's munitions issue is serious. That's according to Dana Strahl, a former senior US defense official with responsibility for the Middle East. If Iran responds to an Israel attack with a massive airstrike campaign and Hezbollah joins in too, Israel air defenses will be stretched. Strahl also added that US stockpiles were not limitless. This is the killer quote. The US can't continue supplying Ukraine and Israel at the same pace. We are reaching a tipping point. A tipping point. Now, at the moment, Israel uses a range of anti-missile systems. There is, of course, the much vaunted Iron Dome. You've probably heard of that many times. That's used to counteract short-range rockets used by Hamas and Hezbollah. There's also David Sling that does a similar job. But for the kinds of ballistic missiles most recently deployed by Iran, Israel has a different system. That's called Arrow, Arrow 2 and 3. And as we saw a few weeks ago, that isn't perfect. That's because these are exceptionally hard projectiles to intercept. They're traveling at supersonic speeds. Now, THAAD will sit alongside Arrow in terms of the medium-range missiles that are coming over, particularly from Hezbollah. According to Israeli figures speaking to the FT, more than 20,000 rockets and missiles have been fired at Israel over the past year from Gaza and Lebanon alone. This is a really crazy quote that struck me from the article. Here it is. It's only a matter of time before Israel starts to run out of interceptors and has to prioritize how they are deployed. Dalia, I found this story really informative, not least because it really underscores how dependent on the United States Israel is for its security.
I mean, absolutely. Israel would not be able to continue this genocide or even to exist in the way that it has existed without the militaristic, financial, political support of the US and of Britain and of Europe more broadly. That is absolutely true. It's a well-documented fact. The US also depends on Israel in a very key way, and that's why this relationship continues. It's a mutually beneficial, symbiotic relationship, and it depends on Israel for two reasons. First of all, this particular part of the world, we can call it the Middle East and North Africa, is a strategically incredibly important and geopolitically incredibly important part of the world, particularly when we see, sort of the post-war era, when you have kind of the Cold War. This region first emerges both because of its oil-rich, its resource-rich landscape, but also where it is in the world. It connects, Europe to Asia to Africa, the Suez Canal. These are all very geopolitically important. This is a very geopolitically important place. And so it's always going to, whoever can rule that roost, as it were, essentially is able to hold hegemonic power more broadly. You cannot be a world superpower without having control over this region's infrastructure and resources. And so what Israel provides is essentially an outpost of US interests. It is a stronghold. It securitizes the US's interests in this very critically geopolitically important region. And what it does is, in exchange for that, is it pretends that it is, offering all of this political and financial support just because it has this authentic belief in a warped idea of Jewish safety. That is not the truth behind why the US state continues to support Israel. It's because Israel represents US interests in the region. Without that stronghold, the US cannot be a global superpower. So that's the first reason why the US is dependent on Israel. The second reason is that Israel has got access, in the people of Gaza, has got access to a people who essentially are completely unprotected by rights. They are a stateless people. They do not have representation or legibility within the kind of legal and rights frameworks that otherwise offer protection to everyone else. And so within that, you have a population that essentially a colonial state like Israel can experiment on endlessly, can hone and develop the most advanced technological and weapon technology and weaponry of war and surveillance that it then sells back to the US and to other colonial powers in order to use in other contexts. And so this is why we see this constant symbiotic relationship. It's why Biden very astutely said that if there was no Israel, the US would need to create an Israel. Now, what we've reached here, I don't believe this idea that there's not enough weapons to go round. I don't think that there is any end to the capacity of the US military industrial complex. I think what's happened now is that, first of all, the US doesn't require Israel to do a genocide in order to maintain its particular interest in the region. It's willing to pay the price of a genocide, but it doesn't inherently require one. It just requires a sort of general sense of resource domination. But also, as this war begins to spill into a more regional spill out into the region, and particularly as it begins to bait and goad Iran into a direct regional war, we then have a scenario whereby the equilibrium of this power, this relationship, this mutually beneficial relationship, begins to tip a little bit away from the US's interest. And so I think this kind of warning shot, this idea that there's not enough weapons to go around, is really a way of the US trying to kind of pull back from a regional war that could potentially make this situation that had otherwise been working quite nicely, really, for the US political and financial elite to actually tip into kind of more unpredictable territory. And particularly as we have, the US otherwise is somewhat of a declining superpower, the rise of China, the ongoing struggles with Russia, the fact that the BRICS are kind of adding to their fold. There is this sense of an uncertainty of the US's status as a superpower that you then throw in something as risky as a regional war with Iran that doesn't really serve the US's interests as much as maintaining the status quo of beforehand did. So I think that's really what's happening, rather than an authentic sense that genuinely, if this did get into a war with Iran, that the US would not wholeheartedly and provide all the weapons needed for Israel to fight in that war. But it's not actually as desirable an option as the kind of equilibrium status quo of just the everyday sort of settler violence against the Palestinians that had maintained an equilibrium that had worked quite well for the US previously. The expanding of the contours of this war puts it into a risky territory and unpredictability that the US at this particular administration, the US, could be very different under a Trump administration, but under a Democrat administration is not the conditions that they want to operate in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about the missiles. I mean, I kind of do. I think it's a plausible point you're making, Dalia. And clearly, if the United States wants to arm Israel, it can. But I think the point is, 20,000 missiles, short, medium, and long range, have been used against Israel in the last 12 months. 20,000. Then you've got a major conflict in Russia, and you also have to think that the peer rival that the US is really worried about is China, as you talk about. And of course, the US can stock Ukraine. It can, assist Israel. But I think to do that, as well as, of course, prepare for some kind of conflict with China, which is part of the sort of doctrine right now in Washington. But to do that, you probably need something bordering on a war economy. Now, to some extent, of course, the US has had a permanent war economy with its military-industrial complex, but it would probably have to do even more. I mean, the amount of armaments right now that Ukraine is going through is just unbelievable. And I suppose if there's a sort of list of priorities in Washington, okay, well, of all these conflicts, which one could we really do without in the next few years? It probably is an escalation between Israel and Iran. Well, there's certainly food for thought. And that point you make about Israel being an outpost of US interests in the region, I mean, it's quite interesting when you look at what Theodor Herzl, godfather of Zionism, writes, more than 100 years ago. He's overtly saying, we can do this. Let's have Israel, give us Israel, be part of allowing us to have a state, and we can be that outpost of empire in West Asia. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think this stuff. He's saying it. We've got some news that broke just before we went live. We're getting on top of it. The US has threatened to cut military aid to Israel if it doesn't increase the level of humanitarian aid entering Gaza, within the next 30 days. The letter to Israel's government, signed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and seen by the BBC, says failure to boost aid getting into Gaza may have, quote, implications for US policy. It also states that over the last month, Israel has denied or impeded nearly 90% of humanitarian movements between North and South Gaza. 90%. Extraordinary. 90%. Overseen by the world's most moral army. Last week, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said that there was a £25 billion black hole in Labour's tax plans. Already, there were unfunded commitments by the previous Conservative government, like reducing employees' national insurance contributions. And now, Labour want to award long overdue pay rises to NHS staff and rail workers. Indeed, Britain ran a deficit of £120 billion last year. It's around 4.4% of GDP. Plus, like I say, Labour want to spend more, quite rightly, in my view. So either you need to make cuts, borrow more, or tax more. And Labour has ruled out one and will only do two in order to invest rather than pay for everyday spending. So they'll borrow to invest, to build stuff, but not to pay people's wages. Which just leaves number 3, tax rises. And today, with a little over 2 weeks before Rachel Reeves delivers her autumn budget, Keir Starmer told the BBC this.
Did your manifesto rule out increasing any rate of national insurance, employers or employees, or was it merely talking about ruling out increasing the employees' rate?
We were very clear in the manifesto that we wouldn't be increasing tax on working people, and we expressly said that that was income tax, that was NICs, etc. So we set that out in the manifesto.
But NICs just for employees?
Well, it's very clear from the manifesto that what we were saying is we're not going to raise tax for working people. And it wasn't just the manifesto, we said it repeatedly in the campaign. And we intend to keep the promises that we made in our manifesto. So I'm not going to reveal to you the details of the budget. You know that that's not possible at this stage. What I will say is, where we made promises in our manifesto, we'll be keeping those promises.
Keir Starmer keeping promises. I'll believe it when I see it. The Prime Minister there leaving the door open for a hike in employer national insurance contributions. That was also the position of the Chancellor Rachel Reeves yesterday when she adopted exactly the same line. No increases in income tax or employee contributions. That's what we said. Here's the BBC's Henry Zeffman responding to those comments by the Prime Minister and offering some background.
Henry, what came up? Did he talk about the national insurance employer contribution going up?
He did. He didn't want to, but I made him. And crucially, the Prime Minister gave his view on the dispute that I was talking about with Nick at 6:30, which is what precisely did the Labour manifesto before the general election say about national insurance? Some people say that the manifesto gave the impression that a Labour government would not increase national insurance at all, either the employer rate or the employee rate. Keir Starmer has for the first time indicated that he agrees with Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who was speaking about this yesterday, and Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary, who was speaking about this on Sunday, that the only commitment Labour Party made before the election was not to increase the employee rate of national insurance. I'd say that is as good as confirmation you will ever get in the run-up to a budget that this government is going to increase that employer rate of national insurance.
By the way, just before we move on, I don't think that employer national insurance breaches what Labour said in their manifesto, right? It's not often I'm defending Keir Starmer on here, but that's just my view. Meanwhile, here's Rain Newton-Smith. She's the head of the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. She was speaking on the Today programme earlier in the show.
How might employers react to the raising of their national insurance contributions for staff?
I think employers will see this as a difficult move, and what they will want to judge the budget on is how much does it really lead to the government's mission to raise growth and investment. And if we see a rise in national insurance contributions paid by employers, that's going to increase the cost of taking someone on, of creating a job. And that will make it more difficult for businesses, particularly those who are creating a lot of jobs in across our hospitality sector, our hotels, our pubs, And it is in the context where we've seen big increases in the national living wage over the last couple of years, which I think businesses have supported as part of raising living standards and growth and productivity. But if those overall increases in costs of hiring aren't matched by higher productivity, then it makes it harder for businesses to create the jobs and the growth that we need to really fund our public services.
So what is your warning then to the government? Are you saying to them, be aware that if you do this, and it seems pretty clear that they are going to do this now, judging by the signals, that it may reduce hiring or limit pay rises or both?
What would need to happen is it really needs to be in the broader context of a broader strategy around how the government will approach the costs that businesses face in hiring. So Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has committed to setting out a business tax roadmap at this budget. That's got to be really clear that that will have a tax landscape which is competitive, which makes it easy for businesses to invest and grow and create jobs. And if we see an increase in national insurance contributions, of course, it matters to what level. Businesses will also want to know, are the government helping them to make it easy to invest in training?
Really interesting. Really, really interesting. Note that she's not condemning the government. She's not attacking the government. This is a major, major potential increase in taxes on employers. Let's listen to some more of that interview.
I think you are saying essentially to the government, if you are going to do this, if you are going to increase employers' national insurance contributions, mitigate it in some way, reduce the impact of business taxes or increase incentives, offset it for us in some other way.
Yeah, if you're looking at, particularly in sectors like our high street shops and our manufacturing and others, and particularly in transport and aviation, who already face a high burden from property taxation, from our business rate system, and that we're in April, that system will see an increase if no action is taken in the overall burden from business rates. So if you couple that with an increase in national insurance contributions that employers would face, you're increasing the overall burden in hiring. So it really does need to be set in a broader context. And we really need to make sure that ultimately this is a budget which chooses growth and investment, because we know that's what we need to ensure that we can fund our public services, that we can fulfill the government's mission to drive growth and wealth creation. That's what the government have set out to do. So we need to look at the measures that are set out in the budget as a whole and ensure that that mission is making it easy for the businesses who will be driving that growth and productivity.
Now that sounds to me like the CBI think business can live with this, which surprised me. Not that you should listen to the CBI, an organisation which cheered on the madness of austerity after 2010. Arguably, I don't think it should exist anymore, but frankly, that's probably something you'd expect me to say. And of course, like basically everyone at the CBI, Newton Smith talks about representing business interests despite never actually having had a business, all of which generally means these types of people view global multinationals and big supermarkets as business rather than small and medium-sized businesses, which quantitatively, by the way, just employ far more people. In terms of the specifics here, the Resolution Foundation say that a 13.8% rate for NI pension contributions would raise an annual £12 billion from the private sector by 2030. So basically, that gets you to halfway with this Labour black hole. They estimate this would fall to £9 billion if around £3 billion was used to give full NI relief on employee pension contributions. And how much would this cost employers? Here's the FT with some more useful information. David Lane, Chief Executive of pension provider TPT Retirement Solutions, estimated that an employer paying 10% into its staff pension schemes could be looking at anything between a 1 to 2% increase in their staff payroll bill if national insurance was charged at a flat rate of 13.8%. Of course, that's presently what it is on the employer side, 13.8%. It would also be applied to pension contributions. That's the proposal, right? One poll by the Association of British Insurers and the Reward and Employee Benefits Association found that 42% of companies that currently pay pension contributions above the auto-enrollment minimum would lower them if NI on pensions was introduced, and a particularly high rate, such as that 13.8%, might also lead companies to rethink salary sacrifice schemes, where individuals receive a lower salary in exchange for higher pension contributions. Typically, you would pay more into your pension so that you don't move into a new tax band. Personally, I think what we should expect is employers paying NI on pensions. I think that's going to happen, but I'd be surprised if it kicks in at 13.8%, at least straight away. But it does make you think. The deficit last year was £120 billion. Debt to GDP is 100%. It was 60%, by the way, when George Osborne entered number 11 in 2010. He said he was going to cut the deficit, remove the deficit, and get on top of the debt. Debt has increased by 40%. Annual debt interest spending is forecast to be around £39 billion higher over the next few years than in the period running up to the pandemic, because, of course, interest rates are higher. Meanwhile, state pensions and social security benefits are forecast to run 1.1% higher, which is about £32 billion in today's terms. So higher interest rates and an aging population, a lot of money is being spent there. And yet the right and big business often refuses to accept any tax rises, any. Have you tried reading The Telegraph recently? It's incomprehensible. No increase in capital gains tax, no land tax, ditch inheritance tax, don't reform council tax, reduce corporation and income tax. It does make you wonder, do they not realise the situation they've left the country in? Or the fact that ultimately the economic foundation of the UK over the last 40 years is over. It's finished. We're not going back to the 1980s, my friends. But I guess they don't realise that because, of course, they're partly responsible. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has suggested a new way to boost the economy and funnel unemployed people back into work. That's by giving them a weight loss jab. Wes Streeting made the suggestion in an op-ed for the Daily Telegraph, writing this: "Our widening waistbands are also placing a significant burden on our health service, costing the NHS £11 billion a year, even more than smoking, and it's holding back our economy. Illness caused by obesity causes people to take an extra 4 sick days a year, on average 4, while many others are forced out of work altogether. The long-term benefits of these drugs could be monumental in our approach to tackling obesity. For many people, these weight loss jabs will be life-changing, help them get back to work, and ease the demands on our NHS." The weight loss jab news comes after the government announced nearly £300 million of investment from US drug giant Eli Lilly at this week's International Investment Summit. Eli Lilly will reportedly be running trials to find out whether their weight loss jab, Mounjaro, can help unemployed people living with obesity get back to work. Keir Starmer was asked about the plans this morning on BBC Breakfast.
Is it your view, like the Health Secretary's, that weight loss drugs could play a big role in solving worklessness and economic inactivity?
I think these drugs could be very important for our economy and for health. Again, the story behind this is really interesting. Here's one of the biggest pharmaceutical businesses, pharma companies, that's decided now's the time to put the investment into our country. This is consistent with our pitch, which is, now's the time to invest in Britain. Doing their research here, this drug will be very helpful to people who want to lose weight, need to lose weight. Very important for the economy so that people can get back into work. Very important for the NHS because, as I've said time and again, yes, we need more money for our NHS, but we've got to think differently. We've got to reduce the pressure on the NHS. So this will help in all of those areas.
Sometimes with Keir Starmer, I think, what on earth are you talking about? This is a trial for a big pharma company to see if a certain kind of treatment works in getting people back into work, right? It's going to make them money. It's a pilot. He's calling it investing in Britain. I have to say, I was watching the show yesterday, and there was Michael Walker's coverage of this quote unquote investment, the £63 billion worth of investment. Lots of it's not investment, right? We have tens of billions of pounds of quote unquote investment coming from asset managers. They ain't investing. They're making money. That's what asset managers do. They buy low, they don't invest, they jack up prices, they sell. That's what Macquarie did with Thames Water. If you want to know more about asset management and basically how it destroys countries, I did an interview with, I would say, one of the best people in Europe to speak to this about. His name is Brett Christophers. That's a downstream. If you just put in asset managers, downstream, Novara Media, it will come up. I think it's got about 350,000 views, which I wasn't expecting, but turns out people really care about this stuff. But my goodness, investment. What are you talking about investment? It's ridiculous. It's a pilot. And if it works, Eli Lilly will be quids in. However, this announcement has prompted cries of, quote, nanny statism. Here's Richard Madeley on Good Morning Britain.
Jabs for jobs. I mean, weight loss injections to get unemployed, obese people thin enough to go back to work. It all sounds a bit sinister to me, slightly, a bit dystopian. There's a kind of state interference into people's absolute private choices in how much they drink. And if it does work, all right, I agree with you, it's a very long trial, isn't it? Why does it have to be 5 years? But if it does work, where do we go from there? What choices might people have? People who can't work because they're overweight. Well, if you don't have these injections, Mr. Smith, I'm afraid you're not getting it.
Richard Madeley, the defender of civil liberties there. Medications like Ozempic and Wegovy have exploded in popularity over the last few years, due in part to their use by A-list celebrities. Ozempic is only licensed for the treatment of type 2 diabetes in the UK. Wegovy is available on the NHS, but as a treatment for obesity in some cases, but is mostly bought privately from pharmacies. They're basically the same. They are both semaglutides. The causal mechanisms and how they work with regards to insulin resistance, etc., essentially the same. A surge in demand last year led to a rise in unregulated black market jabs being sold online, some of which saw people who use them being hospitalized. So there's obviously a great many people in the UK who want these drugs, even though they do come with some rather unpleasant side effects, including vomiting and diarrhea. And there is reportedly a strong possibility that weight loss jabs are indeed having an impact on overall rates of obesity in the US. Between 2020 and 2023, the obesity rate in among American adults fell by 2%. That is the first time that's happened on record. Given weight loss jabs hit the market in 2021, it's probably fair to say they had a hand in what was an unprecedented drop. So these injections work, as long as you keep taking them at least, but they are expensive and they don't address the root causes of why some people become obese in the first place, such as ultra-processed foods, income and time poverty, sedentary lifestyles, and certain kinds of job. Here's obesity policy specialist Dr. Dolly Van Tuliken on the Today programme.
There are some serious ethical, financial and efficacy considerations with such an approach. But
such
as looking at people or measuring people based on their potential economic value rather than primarily based on their needs and their health needs around that. And it's incredibly important too that people in the UK access healthcare based on their health need rather than their potential economic value. But it's also looking at the numbers of eligible people. The government would be nowhere near able to cover the eligible population. We're talking the eligible population in the millions, whereas the specialist weight management services are estimated to treat, we're talking around sort of 49,000 people per year. And the problem with it is that we've got the majority of the working age population living with obesity and overweight, which points a huge question related to our food environment. So we actually live in a food environment where it's harder for people to eat well than it is to eat food that's harmful to our health.
Dalia, what's your take on this?
I'm not going to get into the kind of weeds of the efficacy of these drugs or like the ethics of these drugs. That's not really my kind of area. What I will say is that the first red flag that sort of was screaming in my head was, oh, this is essentially like a huge state subsidy to the pharmaceutical companies. Eli Lilly in particular, some of you might remember, had recently had to settle a huge lawsuit with the state of Minnesota because it was price gouging the cost of insulin. That's what these companies are. And you're completely right to say this is an investment. This is just about making these big giving state handouts essentially to these big pharmaceutical companies. And we know as well that Wes Streeting, far more than the average Labour voter or Labour member, is very keen to parcel off parts of our NHS to the private healthcare industry. What I will say is that what is so for the politics of this announcement, because this isn't just a policy, this is a specific policy announcement that Wes Streeting wants on the headlines, that he wants to make it really known. This is not a little footnote of a policy that is going on under the radar. This is something that Wes Streeting wants to be as part of his brand. And that is what really troubles me about this, because ultimately what Wes Streeting is doing is he's taking two things that we can clearly see. A, that Britain is suffering a huge crisis of productivity and a huge crisis in growth. And also that we have a deeply under-resourced NHS. And instead of actually talking about the root causes of why those two things exist, which is that the era of cheap growth in countries like Britain and economies like Britain is over, that we have an aging population that means that lots of people are not working. A lot of people also aren't working because of chronic illness, namely because of, COVID, mass disabling event. 22% of people with long COVID were unable to return to work. We also live in societies that make us chronically unwell, that inflame us, that, and mean that we can't eat and rest and work and sleep in ways that are actually conducive to our health. So, these systems are making us unwell, which ironically then makes it very difficult for us to work. And also that the NHS is chronically underfunded. And I'm not saying that Wes Streeting can come up with a silver bullet policy that can address all of those issues in one go. But what Wes Streeting could do is not pick a group of people, i.e. people living with obesity, that are already stigmatized, who are already blamed for society, for all kinds of social failures, who are blamed for so many different things, who are stigmatized, who are humiliated routinely in our media and in our society, and basically, just for want of a better word, taking extra jabs at them, like taking these extra, like basically continuing this culture, which, because ultimately the subtext of the headline that Wes Streeting wanted to put out there is that the reason that we're having a crisis in our NHS, the reason we're having a crisis of productivity is because some people are lazy. That's ultimately what he's saying, because unfortunately we live in a society where people think that judging on the basis of people's looks, on people's body size, that you can make a moral judgment on their character. And he's drawing on that to whip up hatred and anger and stigma against a group of people that are already incredibly stigmatized and who are already blamed for so many different things. And this is a classic MO of the culture war, Wes Streeting type of politics, which is, instead of actually addressing any of the root causes of these issues, I mean, the fact that, for example, if we did a one-off tax, a one-off 1% tax on millionaires in Britain, we would raise enough money to plug the NHS funding gap for 5 years. Instead of talking about those kinds of policies, he's picking on a group of people that are already deeply stigmatized. And that is the MO of Wes Streeting. And that's the thing that he can't resist doing. And so for me, this is a deeply lazy headline. It's a deeply lazy policy, and it's cruel. And that is ultimately, we saw him going after trans people. We've seen him doing this before. He engages in a cruel, unsubstantive politics, and his presence in politics is about obfuscating at worst and stigmatizing and being cruel, obfuscating at best and stigmatizing at worst. That is what he does, instead of actually engaging with the real reasons behind these crises that we have. So for me, this was really all about generating a headline that makes him look like a tough guy, to a particular image that he has of the British public that is endlessly cruel and small-minded and prejudiced. There is no actual foundation in blaming people living with obesity for the crisis in productivity that we have, or for the crisis in the NHS that we have. But it's an easy, cheap shot to make. And that is unfortunately what Wes Streeting's career has so far been full of.
Yes, I mean, I have to say that the framing as well about, 4 lost days, 4 more sick days if you're obese, just petrifying. I think if obviously you've got diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which of course one of these is used for already on the NHS. I mean, good. If patients, if citizens want to access these drugs in order to live a different kind of lifestyle, to be healthier. I'm down with that. I think it's good. But the worry is this jabs for jobs thing. I mean, where does it end? Sorry, you don't get job seekers allowance, or you don't get housing benefit, or you don't get child benefit if you take your jab this week. Citizen, have you taken your jab? If you haven't, then I'm afraid those benefits, even in-work benefits, might be withdrawn. It is kind of dystopian. And it's kind of interesting that when you saw vaccine mandates, sort of a subsection of the right was like, how could you conditionalize somebody's ability to go to work on being jabbed with something? Does seem like that could be the direction for Labour here. Let's see how the pilot works out. Also, if we want people to be slimmer and we want lower rates of obesity, we need to do stuff on ultra-processed food and build walkable cities. Build walkable cities. That's the big thing that's changed since the 1950s. The belief that Israel's actions amount to apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide is, quote, worthy of respect in a democratic society. That's the conclusion of an employment tribunal in a landmark decision. In February, that same tribunal ruled that Professor David Miller, previously a professor of political sociology at the University of Bristol, was unfairly discriminated against when he was dismissed over allegations of making anti-Semitic remarks. The tribunal has now published its 120-page judgment, setting out why Miller's beliefs warranted protection under anti-discrimination laws. Specifically, how Miller's anti-Zionist beliefs qualify as a philosophical belief and, quote, as a protected characteristic pursuant to Section 10 of the Equality Act 2010. Passing the ruling, employment judge Rohan Pirani said this: although many would vehemently and cogently disagree with Miller's analysis of politics and history, others have the same or similar beliefs. We find that he has established that the criteria have been met and that his belief amounted to a philosophical belief. These excerpts from the judgment are particularly illuminating. On page 8, we see the basis for David Miller's personal beliefs. The claimant believes, and also believed when he was employed by the university, that Zionism, which he defines as an ideology that asserts that a state for Jewish people ought to be established and maintained in the territory that formerly comprised the British Mandate of Palestine, is inherently racist, imperialist, and colonial. He also considers Zionism to be offensive to human dignity on that basis, and he therefore opposes it. His belief system is to some extent informed by his research on Northern Ireland, which was the subject of his PhD thesis. It was a fundamental belief of his that the Irish and Algerian, South African and Palestinian struggles were best explained as settler colonial conflicts. His anti-Zionism comes from his belief and understanding of settler colonialism as intrinsic to Zionism. The claimant also describes himself as anti-loyalist, although not anti-Protestant, regarding Ireland, and anti-Afrikaner nationalist, although not anti-white, in respect of South Africa. The specific development of his views on Palestine came as a result of his engagement with the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and he's also read extensively on the issue. The claimant explained in his evidence to the tribunal that by the late 1990s, his beliefs in relation to Zionism were fully formed. This is the quote: I have at all times since that date believed Zionism to be a settler, colonial and ethno-nationalist movement that seeks to assert Jewish hegemony and political control over the land of historic Palestine. Finally, there's this, with Miller believing that Zionism to be a form of racism because it necessarily calls for the displacement and disenfranchisement of non-Jews in favour of Jews, and it is therefore ideologically bound to lead to the practices of apartheid, ethnic cleansing and genocide in pursuit of territorial control and expansion. He added that Zionism was ideologically bound to lead to the practice of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, but he told the panel that his anti-Zionism did not equate to opposition towards Jews. I've read most of the judgment, by the way. I basically agree with everything that David Miller's saying. I think historically it's incontrovertible. I did an interview with Ilan Pape, a great scholar on this stuff. I think he'd basically agree with pretty much all of this. Of course, the point is that holding those beliefs is protected under law. You might disagree with them, but you can't fire somebody for them. What started all of this is when two Jewish students complained about a 2019 lecture by Miller in which he identified Zionism as one of the 5 pillars of Islamophobia. The Community Support Trust, which campaigns against anti-Semitism, said Miller's remarks were a disgraceful slur, but a review commissioned by the university found Miller had no case to answer because he did not express hatred towards Jewish people. In an email to the university's student newspaper sent in February 2021, Miller said, quote, "Zionism is and always has been a racist, violent, imperialist ideology premised on ethnic cleansing." In the message, he also claimed the university's Jewish Society was, quote, "an Israel lobby group." A separate review by the university found these statements had been offensive to many, and in a hearing, they were found to be wrong and inappropriate. It was then that Miller was sacked for gross misconduct, the panel heard. When Miller's appeal was subsequently rejected, he took the university to a tribunal, which he won earlier this year. On Miller's anti-Zionist beliefs, Pirani, the presiding judge, said this: "We conclude that they have played a significant role in his life for many years. We're satisfied that they are genuinely held. He is and was a committed anti-Zionist, and his views on this topic have played a significant role in his life for many years." The panel found that Mr. Miller's belief had met the criteria of being worthy of respect in a democratic society, not incompatible with human dignity, and not in conflict with the fundamental rights of others. Pirani also added that Professor Miller's opposition to Zionism is, quote, "not opposition to the idea of Jewish self-determination or a preponderantly Jewish state existing in the world, but rather, as he defines it, to the exclusive realization of Jewish rights to self-determination within a land that is home to a very substantial non-Jewish population." While finding it was extraordinary and ill-judged to express himself publicly in the way he did, Judge Pirani added that the decision to dismiss was, quote, "because of manifestations of Miller's belief." What Miller said was accepted as lawful, was not anti-Semitic, and did not incite violence, and did not pose any threat to any person's health or safety. The panel also found what Miller said in his email contributed to and played a material part in his dismissal, however, and as a result, whatever compensation he eventually is awarded will be halved. That compensation will itself be decided at a later remedy hearing. Dalia, that's quite an extraordinary several sort of passages I just read there, and this seems like quite a breakthrough judgment. It's going to have really serious implications, isn't it?
Yeah, I do kind of wonder how this squares with the fact that so many institutions, including educational institutions, uncritically adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which did include belief that Israel is an inherently racist endeavor. That, you know, famously, that was, many institutions have adopted that as sort of intolerable speech. So it's kind of I wonder how this will play out in relation to that. What I would say is that, to me, there's a very interesting difference between how repression of pro-Palestine speech in the UK operates differently to repression of pro-Palestine speech in the US. They're kind of the inverse of one another, in the sense that in the US, it's very difficult because they have the Second Amendment, it's very difficult for the state to directly prosecute someone for expressing an opinion or for associating, in particular, you know, having freedom of association and freedom of speech. These are freedom of speech, and in terms of protection from state persecution, is kind of enshrined in the Constitution. But they have extremely weak labor laws, which means the way that the repression happens is by the fact that it's very easy to be fired for holding certain opinions and beliefs, particularly on the issue of Palestine. Whereas in the UK, it's kind of the opposite, where actually, particularly with counter-terror legislation, there is quite a lot of scope for the state to kind of go after you for particular opinions. You know, we saw, for example, that the young woman who was prosecuted for having a banner that called Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman coconuts. So there's that kind of scope there of the state going after you for speech or opinions. And yet, because we have these really strong labor laws, it's actually much more difficult for your employer to fire you for having strongly held beliefs, even if those are beliefs that the state might prosecute you for. So I think that's a really interesting parallel, because if this was in the US, I mean, people in the US in far higher positions, including in tenured positions in academia, have been fired for saying things or liking posts or expressing opinions, particular opinions on Palestine. So David Miller his case would have been just a footnote in that. Whereas here, that kind of labor law is our sort of frontier, as it were. So I don't know which poison I would pick, but it's interesting to kind of think about how the kind of particular conditions in both countries is quite different, where one is, you're more likely to get prosecuted by the state, and the other one, you're more likely to get fired from your job. I'm not sure which I pick, but I know which one I'm living in.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point. I mean, I'm a big advocate of free speech. I think we should have the constitutional right to free speech like the US has. But it's fascinating, like you say, Dalia, this seems like a really robust process to defend this person's free speech, and actually, more importantly, freedom of political conscience. But what I would say is, when you look at, for instance, prescribed organizations, now I'm not defending or supporting any prescribed organizations, but it seems strange to me that a Home Secretary can prescribe X or Y organization and it immediately becomes a criminal offense for somebody to say, well, actually, I think they're justified in doing X or Y. I find that rather strange, so arbitrary, giving so much power to one person, i.e. the Home Secretary, and you have a robust, I think, very fair process, as we see here, with regards to the Equality Act and David Miller. There's a big asymmetry there. I think it's a really important observation you made there, Dalia. We have a super chat, thanks to Kasia, I think that's a better way of putting it. My apologies. Kasia ITP for a £50 super chat. Yes, Kasia ITP, which is about the weight loss jab story. It says, Dalia's contribution about the system making us ill made me tear up unexpectedly. Both my parents are retired and too ill to enjoy any of it. I'm really sorry to hear that, Kasia. Makes me so angry, but thanks for covering it. Thank you for that super chat. Thank you very much. We are going to go a little bit over tonight. We've got another story. But before we do go to that final story, I just want to say, if you want to support our work, if you think what we're doing is worthy of support, go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. We're trying to shift politics in this country, and we've always said at Novara Media, new media, different politics. You can't do the latter without the former. What I love about Novara is the range of voices. I love it. I was listening to Ash and Moya's podcast the other day. Then I was watching Michael yesterday, Dalia this evening. Range of voices, interests. Novara FM, of course, hosted by several people, including Richard Hames. We had Chal Ravens hosting a show there too. Really, really, really enjoyable podcast they're making right now. If you want to help us build this organization, like I said, create a different kind of media, go to novaramedia.com/support. And like I say, the link is in the description below. A disgraced former comedian and Hollywood star Russell Brand has spent years peddling conspiracy theories on YouTube. And just last year, he was accused of rape, sexual assault, and emotional abuse by 4 women, one of whom was as young as 16 at the time. Those are accusations that Brand denies. And since then, he's been baptized by Bear Grylls in an attempt to rebrand himself as a born-again Christian, although he might be Catholic because he's uploaded videos where he's praying the rosary. Anyway, it now seems he might be struggling for cash these days.
Hello, I'm just back from Narnia, where I had a holiday, Mr. Tumnus, Aslan, all those guys. And as you know, airports are places full of Wi-Fi and all sorts of evil energies. Think of all the phones out there, all of the signals, corruptible and corrupting. Luckily, I wear this magical amulet from Airstech that keeps me safe from all of the various signals out there. And also means, look at this, look how strong I am. I think this is making me more powerful, as a matter of fact. Look at that. This stuff is absolutely packed with Airstech. I didn't even bring any socks or toothbrush or dog meat or anything like that. Just completely full of Airstech. You should get one as well, particularly if you're planning to go to an airport anytime soon, because the bloody things are full of lethal signals. Airstech, a glorious amulet to protect you from corrupting signals.
Was this a satire? I don't think it was, because, well, we know it wasn't a satire. He's flogging these amulets for, well, they cost £180. The amulets. I mean, they probably cost about 180p to make, probably not even that. Big markup on them, I'm sure. I'm sure a lot of that markup's going towards Russell Brand. Just crazy. You're calling yourself a Christian, and then you've got a pagan amulet, which is fine, but to stop Wi-Fi in airports specifically. Dalia, what do you make of this?
This is why financial literacy is so important, because how are you, someone who was probably making millions and millions of pounds, overnight suddenly so strapped for cash that you are flogging pagan amulets on the internet? Like, I don't understand where all your cash went. But I mean, it's deeply embarrassing. But I also think there's something to be said about this trend of men, allegedly abusing their power, doing all sorts of things. And then when they get caught out, turning around and saying, well, I've seen the light, I found God. And it's like, look, I'm not going to cast judgment on people's spiritual journeys. I'm not going to say whether or not I believe something like that. It's deeply personal. But what I would say is that what I know of most, spiritual journeys is that it involves some kind of accountability. And for me, it's like, if you've made this claim to suddenly seeing the light and being a better person, when that comes without any accountability, any recognition, any kind of just realization or self-awareness of the harm that you've caused to other people in the ways in which you've allegedly abused your power, then really you've not really been on that to me is a telltale sign that you've not been on a spiritual journey. You're just trying to be on a journey of saving your own ass.
I couldn't agree more. There's a tweet that he posted recently saying about how wonderful it is to be redeemed or whatever. I can't remember the exact formulation. Doesn't work like that, right? The Catholic Church is about forgiveness, asking for forgiveness every day. Every day you've transgressed somebody, forgive me. And I forgive the people who transgress me. That's the point, right? It's meant to be about forgiveness. And of course, in Islam, submission. This is not the same as, I'm redeemed. All the bad stuff I've done is all forgiven now. Great, I can sell amulets on TikTok. I don't think that's how it works anyway. Dalia, thanks for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow. We'll be back from 6 p.m. for another show. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.